Prairie Grove, Arkansas, 1862. This was the site of one of the most important battles in the American Civil War. The Union forces of the North and the Confederate forces of the South met here in a fierce fight that resulted in over 2,000 casualties. An event that changed the course of Arkansas history, this is the Battle of Prairie Grove. It's December 7th, 1862 in northwest Arkansas. The Union and Confederate armies are preparing for a battle that will change the course of Arkansas history forever. The battle took place in Prairie Grove, Arkansas, a location the two armies didn't intend to fight at.
Well, the battle just kind of happened. The Confederates had come up to attack General Blunt with his 5,000 men at Cane Hill, and while they were making preparations for what was going to be a battle down there, a messenger came in and said that the other half of the Union Army, which had been in Springfield, Missouri, was in Fayetteville. And so the Confederates left a diversion of 400 men down at Cane Hill to keep that army occupied. Meanwhile, the rest of the Confederate Army started moving this direction, trying to intercept the Union Army coming from Fayetteville. Those guys had just made a forced march of 130 miles in 3 days. They're worn out, they're tired, they're exhausted. They're perceived as a weaker threat, so they'll destroy them first and then go back to Cane Hill and worry about the Union Army that's down there. And so this is where those two armies just happened to clash. There wasn't really a strategy or anything set up. It's just, as they're marching towards each other, this is where they ran into each other.
Victory in the Battle of Prairie Grove would be determined by which side had the better weapons, an advantage the Union possessed.
There were literally hundreds of different kinds of weapons used. Cannons, there's probably 8 or 10 different kinds of cannons used. The kinds of small arms, the muskets and rifles they used, they're just countless. Some people had just hunting rifles from home. Some guys just had shotguns. A couple of units had European antique weapons that were about 20 years old and weighed 20 pounds apiece. Then others on both sides had the state-of-the-art weapons like Enfield rifles and Springfield rifles, which were the two most popular used in the whole war by both sides.
The cavalry would have been armed with pistols, Colt revolvers on the Confederate side, probably Remington revolvers on the Union side, and then the cavalry also carried carbines as well.
I'm sitting here holding a Sharps 50 caliber carbine. This was used by the mounted soldiers for the North. It's fired a 50 caliber round, and it had, as you see, you cock it like that. This would come down and strike the primer. And you loaded it, it's interesting because it was a relatively new design, and you loaded it by taking this rod out and putting your bullets in there. And you can see how large this is. It shot a 50 caliber round, which is huge. And you ended it up like this. Okay. This is heavy. This weighs about, I would say, 8 or 9 pounds. And that's heavy for a weapon to carry. But the other ones, the other rifles were even bigger, and they were more heavy. This is essentially a carbine, went into the boot on the side of the saddle, and they could take it out and shoot with it. It says, if you look here, it also has a sight that has graduated things so you can see how far you had to go. You had a V sight. Up here was the thing you looked at, and you could gauge how far it was. If it was 400 yards away, you put it up there. 100 yards away, you put it down. And then you shot accordingly. And there were actually pretty good shots with these things. It was fairly accurate. But they were heavy to carry. But they shot a long ways. Every time you cocked this, a bullet would go feed into the chamber. And they didn't have that before. A lot of times they had the old, how many times you could shoot by loading up muskets. but they didn't have it. They had this now. This is weapons. They were all made by the Sharps Arms Company, and they revolutionized essentially how these worked. This is like most Civil War battles, were fought with cannon and maneuvering your infantry around and trying to get and flank the people that were dug in. The North had better weapons, and what they did have was more accurate cannon. And the South was a lot of conscript troops and just did not have the training that some of the Northern people had. And so when they realized what was happening, Hyman was attacking, the North used their artillery to take out General Hyman's artillery so that they didn't have as much. They put they took them out one by one, and they would concentrate their fire on one of the batteries at a time to take them out of action, and they were successful in doing so, which led to General Hyman for the South not having an effective artillery during the day on December the 7th.
The stronger leader between each side would also determine the victor of the battle.
The Confederate commander was Thomas C. Hyman. The Union commanders were Francis J. Herron and James G. Blunt.
General Herron and General Blunt were the two Army generals for the North. And the South was headed up by a very capable general named Hyman. And they both had about an equal number of troops. And during that time, General Blunt moved his troops towards Arkansas and up towards Pea Ridge. And the South, realizing that he was coming, the generals, Hyman realized he was coming, formed his people in Fort Smith, Arkansas, and then proceeded north to Pea Ridge. And General Blunt had, instead of up at a place called Cane Creek, dug in and near Pea Ridge, and instead of proceeding, he dug in, and realizing he was exposed, his position was exposed, he entreated General Herron to come to his aid. And General Herron made a forced march of a couple of days, and it's amazing how much ground he actually covered, and came to his aid when the battle started. Now, you have to understand, this battle was only a one-day fight. It was on December the 7th, 1862. General Hyman got his troops together in Fort Smith, and he originally sent 5,000 cavalry out to see where to mask his army from the North. Cavalry oftentimes worked as a screening force. They would engage a force and they would delay them, or everybody think the attack was coming, and it would really be coming from someplace else. But General Blunt surprised them. There were about 5,000 people in this cavalry, and he surprised them by moving most of his forces towards, and did not just stop. He fought forward and progressed upon the cavalry of the South, and the cavalry of the South retreated and stopped when General Blunt dug in near Pea Ridge.
At the end of the day, both armies were where they were when the battle started. Neither side had pushed the other side out of their position and kept them out of it. It's just a slugfest up and down the hillside here all day. Casualties are about the same on both sides. In just over 2.5 hours, there are about 2,700 people killed, wounded, and missing, split right down the middle, almost to the man, between the two sides. So in the small picture and just what happened here, it was a draw. The big picture and how the Battle of Prairie Grove fits in with the rest of the war, it was a Union victory. The Confederate Army retreated back to Fort Smith, and once they get south of the Arkansas River, they never come north of the Arkansas River in force again for the rest of the war. So basically they've just lost everything from the Arkansas River north.
After the battle, the Union would move out of northwest Arkansas and continue the march towards Little Rock.
They stayed here for a couple of weeks, just tending to all the wounded and taking care of the dead. And At the end of December, they made an expedition down to Van Buren and Fort Smith to make sure there are no more surprises coming up the road from the Confederates. Chased them out of Fort Smith, which Confederates went on back to Little Rock. The Union Army came back here. General Herron's half of the Army went back into Missouri, went east, got on riverboats, and went down to Vicksburg, and they fought Mississippi, Alabama, and on the Texas coast. That's where they spent the rest of their war, those areas. General Herron's half of the Union Army, they spent most of the rest of the war in Kansas and Indian Territory.
Overall, the Battle of Prairie Grove impacted the future of Arkansas immensely. The Union would continue marching through Arkansas, eventually capturing Little Rock and winning the war. Without this victory for the Union, history as we know it would be changed forever.